Greg Lukianoff, thank you so much for returning to the Remnant.
Yeah, it's great to be back on. Good seeing you.
Good to see you. So, why don't we just do some level setting here while I get my wits about me? What is the health of free speech in America today? Like, if you're giving a report card, how would you do it?
Oh, man, I'm quite worried about the state of free speech. I mean, that's my job, is to worry about the state of free speech. It's why I went to law school in the first place. But I'd say probably my biggest concern is the lack of a clear constituency for free speech for all on either the right or the left. And I think that when free speech becomes a value that's primarily like upheld by centrists, that always kind of leads it, which I'll take.
Right.
You know, if we don't, if the center left and the center right are doing the protecting right now, which it does seem to be the case that they are. But that can lead you into a situation in which, you know, either extreme won't be protected either. The situation for free speech is genuinely scary in the rest of the Anglosphere. Ireland playing with a hate speech law, Canada playing with a law that could result in life imprisonment for speech crimes, people getting arrested on a fairly regular basis now in Britain for quote unquote offensive comments on social media. I'd say the international situation has me worried. The situation on campus is, you know, people are saying that it's kind of realizing what a big mistake it's made and that things need to be fixed. But at the same time, things are still terrible for free speech on campus. And you're having a generation of lawyers graduating who are pretty hostile to free speech. So, you know, business is booming for my organization, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, but that's not a good thing.
Yeah, but I mean, it should be, given that as we've talked about before, the ACLU sort of gave up that franchise. So you had to step into the thing on this idea that, like, I mean, we can talk about Canada, I suppose we can, and UK, which, you know, I don't want to write those places off, but in terms of America, I mean, hasn't it in a certain sense ever been thus? I mean, David French, your former colleague, my former colleague, my sort of colleague still, you know, he makes this point that actually consistent pro-free speech people, like Nat Hentoff, for people who of a certain age might remember.
He was a huge fan of fire.
I'm sure that does not shock me. Have always been pretty outnumbered, but because they sort of sit at the fulcrum at the center of the seesaw, any given controversy, you're going to have slightly less than America taking the anti-free speech side, and sometimes it's on the left, and sometimes it's on the right. But that means that the other half is going to join forces with you. Yeah. And, you know, I was talking about this recently in a meeting about the Dispatch, is like, we're trying to figure out how we can better communicate to our readers that if we're not pissing off a third of you on any given issue or topic, then we're doing the job wrong. Right. And so the task for someone like you and your organization is to be consistent on it. And that way, you know that one side or the other will get your back during any particular controversy. If it's seen like you're picking sides, like the ACLU now does, then people are going to say, oh, they're not really for free speech. They're just for free speech on these kinds of issues. But if you stick to your guns, everyone's going to sort of say, well, I'm not going to completely vilify these guys because they were useful for that last fight, and they may be useful for us for the next fight. I mean, has there ever been a time when there was just a truly broad consensus in America on free speech issues?
I would say that actually I spent a lot of my life in a moment in which free speech law was improving and free speech culture was quite strong. And in my most recent book, Canceling of the American Mind, I talk about expressions that we used to say all the time. And I co-authored Canceling with an author who, when I first met her, was 20. Because I wanted to write with a young person to get more of her perspective, and I talk about some of the idioms, you know, that actually express a good free speech culture. And when I was talking about them, Ricky was like, "Yeah, I never heard those growing up."
Like I may disagree with what you have to say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. That kind
or
of
even
thing.
things as simple as "to each their own" or "everyone's entitled to their opinion." Because "everyone's entitled to your opinion" was one of those things that people would say, and everyone's go, "Yeah, well, of course, everyone's entitled to their opinion." And you don't really get that sense that people actually believe that. I mean, you look at what's happening to Jesse Signal, out on Blue Sky. It's scary, and they really are targeting him for things he never said or never actually did. And then when anytime I kind of like run afoul of some of the most ardent Trump people, like when we took on the Stop Woke Act in Florida, which was, by the way, laughably unconstitutional, but it was attempting to go after the teaching of basically woke topics, but it resulted in forcing. I always feel the worst for the lawyers who had to argue that case, because I'm a lawyer, and the idea of having to go into court and argue, okay, this law is totally constitutional, but under it, you could have Justice Sotomayor come to your class, but she couldn't read her dissent on affirmative action. It's like, no, you just made the argument this is unconstitutional. So I think that we have been in better shape for free speech historically. I think that and I do blame one side more than the other at this point, to be frank, just because I think I'm trying to be intellectually honest. I think the anti-free speech movement on campus, has been everybody thought it was dead after 1995.
Yeah.
But I spent my whole career watching this thing kind of crawling back to life and growing and metastasizing in ways that people weren't paying enough attention to.
So, I mean, I have good news for you.
Yeah, I like good news.
Well, no, just insofar as like, I think there's going to be, I agree with you that, I mean, I assume from what you were saying that the left is worst on this stuff right now. And, I think that's right. Certainly, if we define the left as like the campus left, I think that's sort of indisputable. But we have a new administration coming in where they talk a lot about going after the media, right? And attacking the media and persecuting journalists.
I was just tweeting about this. The opening up the defamation laws, and Trump being on record saying we're going to sue the media more, sue the Des Moines Register, I think, for that poll that showed Iowa was going to go to Harris. But by the way, a reputable pollster, it just ended up being terrifically wrong. But it's like a bad poll, unless they know. The standard is essentially, unless you, first of all, you have to knowingly have lied about it or showed reckless disregard from the truth, which is hard to do in a poll, to be honest.
Right.
But then you also have to show that you were damaged by it in some way. So it's some of the things that the Trump administration or Trump himself has talked about doing, we're pretty worried about, but we're going to fight it just like we always do.
Yeah. I mean, I can make a pretty strong free speech case, not even just a free speech case, a good polling case for why she released that poll. Like the poll, like the anti-free speech thing would have been for her to do what the pollsters call herding, right? Where they kind of shave their results so they're not too much of an outlier. And that messes up the poll aggregators, which need outliers to get more robust averages.
Yeah.
And so like for her to release that thing, I think obviously it was wrong. And like we kind of know why it was wrong. It was like her methodology is outdated. People just don't answer their phones. The people who do answer landlines tend to skew a certain socioeconomic, blah, blah, blah. But if she had refused to put it out for fear of a backlash about being an outlier, that would have been certainly intellectually censorial. But anyway, so be it. I also was thinking, I just heard on the radio today, driving here at breakneck speed, that about the ABC settlement, where ABC News is going to pay to a charity $15 million as penance for George Stephanopoulos saying that Trump was found liable for rape and blah, 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 blah. I haven't heard many First Amendment lawyers say that Trump would have won that lawsuit in court.
No, he wouldn't have.
Right. It sounds very much like sort of a capitulation thing, like spiking the endorsement of Harris and all that. That's all fine. That's not fine. I don't like that spirit of intimidation, but that's politics and that's business decisions and all that. But he had this comment at a press conference. He said, frankly, it shouldn't have been me. It probably should have been the Justice Department that had gone after Stephanopoulos.
Yeah.
That's not great.
No, it's not. Yeah, we're going to have a lot of work. We always have a lot of work. The Harris administration, our biggest fear from them was this obsession with misinformation, disinformation,
right.
Which is just an exception so massive you can drive a truck through it, and that had us appropriately freaked out. But with Trump, it's just such a weird mixed bag of, you get the occasional, like I think tapping David Sachs, for example, as being someone who's kind of their AI guy. That's actually, I'm kind of happy about that.
I'm glad he's doing that rather than foreign policy. I'll give you that.
Yeah. Well, and Jay Bhattacharya, like when he was talk about in the Wall Street Journal, he did a shout out for our campus free speech ranking as being one of the things where you can evaluate schools for how good they are in free speech. But when he was going into a little more detail about some of the stuff that he wants to fund, because freedom of speech and its connection to knowledge creation, they're inextricably linked. And so I think about knowledge creation all the time and how it relates to free speech, particularly because we work in academia. But one of the things that Bhattacharya said is he wants to spend a lot more NIH money on people doing basic replication work to try to figure out what research is BS out there. Right. And that's a great idea. But when it comes to some of the stuff we're hearing about treatment of the media and the defamation law stuff, there's no shortage of work for us. Let's put it that way.
So I mean, I assume we're all against disinformation, and we're against misinformation to a certain extent, though that's a harder thing, right? So disinformation is basically deliberately lying and manipulating facts as a matter of sort of state policy or some other institution's policy, while misinformation is just basically getting it wrong.
Yeah.
And you have to have a certain amount of tolerance for people getting it wrong.
Sure.
Because sometimes wrong is in the eye of the beholder, and also people make mistakes, and that's what debate is about, is like you say something wrong and then people say, hey, that's wrong, and we learn from that's the pursuit of knowledge thing, that's sort of at the Jonathan Rauch's book on the
actually just about to we're both fans
the
of
Constitution of Knowledge stuff requires
that's
science is all about, like you come up with a hypothesis and then you find out if it's wrong. So this misinformation is a really murky thing.
But I really want to underline that, though. Like it's not intuitive to people that reality is extremely hard to know, and it's a never-ending, arduous process.
Right.
And the only way you can get at it is by chipping away at falsity, because one thing you can be pretty confident is, it's not true in some cases. And you never quite even fully get there, to truth itself. So misinformation, disinformation, it kind of like leaves out, it freezes everything generally in the assumptions, usually of the powerful at a given moment. When you think about it, and when you look at some of the stuff we had just assumed was misinformation, particularly during things like COVID, for example, but also, all throughout. So many things that people were trying to argue were misinformation are things that either we now think are plausible or actually true.
Right. So I'm willing, I have a really wide latitude for misinformation as we're defining it here, right? It's like as an editor of a journalistic organization, we try to avoid it very assiduously. Like make sure what you're saying is true to the best of your knowledge and you've kicked the tires on a claim. But you find out new facts, new information, and sometimes you turn out, oh, this thing was wrong, even though these experts told me this, or this is what the numbers said. It turns out the numbers were wrong. You never know. What is your actual position on disinformation? Deliberately putting out falsehoods for, I assume you have a different standard for American citizens doing it versus foreign actors, but where do you draw these lines?
It's tough to tell, for one thing, to distinguish disinformation from misinformation. Certainly, disinformation attempts exist, certainly from China, Russia, etc. And I think sometimes people try to play that down. It's like, no, of course they're doing that. That's well demonstrated. I do agree with Jacob Mishingama. He's a friend whose name I still trip over sometimes. Who's
no one ever does that with Lukianoff.
Yeah, exactly. The future of free speech project. That disinformation is actually, at least the research indicates, it's a lot less influential than people think. So in some cases, like if we're moving and we want to change First Amendment law to address the problem of disinformation, we might be using a cannon to kill a mouse.
Right.
And so I think a lot about how we know what's true. And I was actually talking to John Haidt, my co-author, this morning about we don't talk for a long time, and even though we disagree a little bit on some of the Children's Online Safety Act, which I think is unconstitutional, and he thinks it's good. We disagree on some stuff related to our various fields. But it is funny when we don't talk for a while. I realize we're thinking very similar things on other stuff. And here, and this will take a second. I've spent the last 23 years focusing a lot on campuses. FIRE expanded beyond campus back in 2022, so we do cases off campus as well. But I think we've done such damage to our knowledge creating industries, both journalism and particularly higher ed, by having cancel culture is part of it. Because when you can point to, for every single hot button issue in the United States, you can point to at least one, usually more, professors who's been punished for being on the wrong side of it.
Right.
That's deadly to people's faith in whether or not the experts are telling the truth. And in canceling, I talk about the conformity gauntlet, about all these political litmus tests you have to pass and all these different approaches, all these pressures, bias-related incident programs where you can there's a hotline where you can call and report your classmates and your professors for offensive speech. When you have even one of these conformity-inducing pressures, that's a real problem. But it undermines our ability to be confident that our experts are actually being objective. So the way you actually are able to address disinformation, the only way really, is by having experts that people actually agree are being honest with you. And they've given themselves such a beating over the past couple of years. We're in this kind of epistemically anarchical period.
Yeah.
As we're going into a moment when we're developing AI, to be the sort of epistemic sort of operating system of the entire species. And we're, I think as John put it, and we're flying blind. So we're for knowledge production, we have this great technology that could be incredibly helpful for us to figure out a lot of things. And we have the industries that should be helping us the most with developing it are not doing their job.
I agree with that entirely. But and I want to come back to AI in a second. But
sure.
Just, I mean, this far better than I do. The debates are always about edge case, not always about edge cases. Some of them are slam dunk obvious cases, and there's still an argument.
Oh, so much of my job is so many of my cases that I deal with on a daily basis. I am an old school ACLU guy. I'm willing to defend Nazis, and how often I am defending sensible people saying sensible and true things, and they're not even mean.
Yeah,
is kind of amazing to me.
But
I signed up for jerks.
Where are my skokie Nazis I ordered? But on the disinformation thing, I mean, surely creating a fake video showing somebody, I don't know, let's just say having sex with a goat.
Yeah.
Right. That you think can be prosecuted and policed under First Amendment law or no?
Oh, actually, yeah. So defamation, and we talked about it. There are a couple different versions of defamation, and the standard defamation of a public figure, which is the New York Times v. Sullivan standard, relies on something called actual malice, which is kind of a dumb name because it's not exactly what it doesn't really mean malice. It means that you publish something that either you knew was a lie or showed reckless disregard for the truth. And that applies to public figures if it's a matter of public concern. It's a little more complicated if it's a matter of private concern. But there's a whole other area of defamation that we talked a lot about in First Amendment law back 25 years ago when I was studying it. Oh my God, that's aging.
Depressing.
Called false light defamation. Things that kind of misrepresent, basically create a story that makes it look like you're someone you're not. And so I think that we're entering the golden age of false light defamation claims because you create something that isn't a parody. And that's one of the things that is a little difficult about the AI animation stuff is that, there was something with Kamala Harris saying ridiculous things about herself that Elon really promoted. And you had to rely on the viewer to be like, well, obviously this is a parody. But if you create something that really does seem to be trying to sort of convince people that it's true, that's defamation. That's false light defamation. That could be just even standard defamation. So the First Amendment law tends to be much more thoughtful in some cases than people actually understand. So when I go to Europe, where basically you're supposed to, as an American constitutional lawyer, you're supposed to kind of apologize for our backwardness on free speech. And I'm the jerk who shows up who's kind of like, no, you guys got it all wrong. And by the way, there's a lot more nuance in our law than actually you folks understand.
All right. So staying on campus for just a second, help me think this through, because I'm of the school that says there's nothing wrong with honor codes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really easy. You shouldn't steal, right?
Yep.
Okay. You shouldn't cheat, right? That's pretty easy. But then I also think you probably shouldn't yell "gas the Jews" in the quad. Now, you have the right to say it.
Shouldn't.
But
no disagreement on shouldn't. But can or can't.
But at some point, can't speech... I mean, again, we're talking about an institution in loco parentis that has different stamp. Let's just assume it's a private institution, not a public institution, and all that kind of stuff. What is wrong with saying that some speech is just not consistent with the character formation that we want in an institution of higher education? And then we can have an argument about what does character formation look like and all the rest. Certainly, you could be expelled from a military service academy for saying all sorts of things. But there's we kind of accept it. Well, that's a higher level of contract than just going to Harvard or Yale or anything. But if the point of Harvard and Yale is to create good citizens, that's what the liberal arts were originally about, was to equip people. With the skills and knowledge sets required of a free people. What's wrong with having some standards that just say, look, there's just some things you shouldn't be saying, and it's not consistent with the values of this institution? Now, I'll agree with you up front. It's a big slippery slope problem because of the kinds of things that these institutions want to police rather than the things I think they should police. But what's the problem with the policing qua policing?
Because we've had it, and we've seen what it looks like since at least the 1980s, and that it basically looks like whatever the administrators feel warmly about and whatever they feel hostile to. So if someone's saying, horrible things about Israel, given that's a relatively popular position among administrators, they're going to be like, oh, that's righteous rage. Mm-hmm. But in some cases, we've seen, if they're saying horrible things about Hamas, occasionally that can land a professor. I'm thinking of a real case here, of course.
Yeah.
In actual trouble. So the problem, is that is the reality of bias, and all these rules have to be enforced by actual people. And I believe that there's a real value in knowing what people really think, full stop. Now, when you come to the example of someone saying, gas the Jews, can you say something as horrible as that and it's protected? Yes. Are there contexts in which you're actually creating an environment where you could say, I thought that guy was going to freaking kill me or hurt me? Or can you create a situation in which it is severe, it's harassment of a severe, persistent, or pervasive kind? We're totally with you. I'm very much on the record, by the way. I'm not one of these people who pretends that there's no anti-Semitism problem on campus. I actually got accused, by the way, of there being I guess presumably like Mossad or Israeli psyop against me that convinced me recently that anti-Semitism was a problem on campus. And I'm like, no, that was about 10 years ago on a visit to Berkeley, where I was like, oh, wow, these are not these people who are saying anti-Zionism seem to be filled with an awful lot of pretty nasty, crude stereotypes about Jews. So that one's long since passed. But one of the things Fire's even advocated for reforms to Title VI to make it clear that Jews are actually a protected class and can be protected under the same anti-discrimination laws that protect everybody else. But it has to be something more than simply offensive speech. It has to be a pattern of behavior that's discriminatory, directed, severe, persistent, and pervasive. And by the way, in the last year, we've seen examples of all of these things. So usually for Fire, when we're defending free speech and we get a call from a journalist, we're pointing out that's free speech, that's free speech, that's free speech, that's free speech. Last spring, there was an awful lot more of like, okay, that's free speech, that's actually threat, that's actually harassment. Actually, you don't have an unlimited right to set up an encampment on your camp. That's actually violence in response to freedom of speech. That should get you expelled. So every kind of nasty scenario where you get into the category of, and we of course we defended lots of campus protesters, lots of professors, but so many lines were crossed like this past spring where we were, one of the reasons that media really liked coming to us is we were the only ones who were absolutely neutrally calling balls and strikes.
Right. Which gets to my earlier point about it's hard in the heat of the moment, but the biggest service people like you provide is being willing to be unpopular with one faction or another at any given moment, even if they're your friends in previous fights and in future fights.
Yeah. And the nice thing is we're used to that. I mean, like that comes, like the secret motto at FIRE is we'll drive this bus into a wall if we have to. And we mean that rather than be unprincipled, you know, and it takes it's something that's a point of pride. And the organization, I did a little series on my Substack. There was someone at the Chronicle of Higher Education wondering how FIRE has been able to, be so nonpartisan. And, I listed the things that have helped us. And one is having that kind of crazy sort of ethos, but then also simply making sure that we have people who vote for different candidates on working together to defend freedom of speech. And you need that.
Yeah.
And most other organizations don't even want it.
Yeah.
Because it can be contentious, but once people get used to it, it's a lot more fun. It keeps us intellectually honest, and our holiday parties are a lot more fun. We have great arguments.
That's also good advice for ideological diversity among faculty and administrators.
Oh, right? No kidding. Yeah,
because it's that bubble, it's that confirmation bias problem where, well, of course it's okay to say men can get pregnant, but we need free speech values for people to say, gas the Jews. And, what you police becomes really mismatched from the broader culture if nobody around you is from the broader culture.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot about, like I said, I think a lot about knowledge production and trying to think of ways to make it work better in higher ed when they've created so many disincentives for truth. And the first thing is you have to get rid of those disincentives, and then you have to start thinking about additional structures that could potentially actually help checking and rechecking. Otherwise, you just get this sort of cultural momentum towards what does the group already believe, and that's a real problem. It was weird watching when some of the stats were coming out about people's lack of trust in higher ed and how it's plummeted over the last several years. And I think someone who should have known better saying it was just a right-wing plot. It was someone who's kind of conservative, like talking about like how it was just a right-wing campaign against higher ed. And I was just aghast. I'm like, I've been doing this for 23 years, man. Like, and it's gotten so much worse in the last 10 years, particularly the last 5. They have earned that lack of respect. Good news, at least though, is I think that I don't run into many people, even in academia, who don't get that there's a problem. I mean, when I talk to professors, they think the problem is just everyone else. But when I talk to top administrators a lot at these schools, they realize that they have a problem.
So how do you parse? And I promise we'll get off of the anti-Semitism stuff, but
sure.
It's such a perfect test case because when Jews get evicted from the coalition of the oppressed and get counted as oppressors, all of a sudden, all the old rules about how you're allowed to talk about Jews change. And one of the subterfuges that they used on this is to say, well, I'm not talking about Jews. I'm just talking about Zionists.
Which are Jews you disagree with.
Right. It's
because nobody actually picks on people they agree with.
Right.
Yeah. I mean,
so what do you think? And to be honest, I'm going to give credit. There are legitimate ways to talk about how to be anti-Israel without being anti-Semitic.
Oh, of course, and those people absolutely exist.
Yeah, but in the hothouse atmosphere of mass protests and the incentive structures that come with that, those really fine but yet important distinctions get melted away pretty quickly, and Zionist is just code for Jew for a lot of people. How do you, where do you draw the line on that, or how do you advise administrators to draw the line on that?
Well, it's still, falls into the exceptions we talked about. It could potentially be threatening. If it's a pattern of behavior, it potentially could be harassment. But when I hear about kind of like the some of the horror, because some of the things the students were saying in some cases, they're literally waving around Hamas flags, like
Right.
they were doing stuff that like normies were just kind of rightfully horrified about. But sometimes I felt like what I was hearing from some of the people who were who hated this response from the students and wanted it to shut it up is as if we'd be doing the world any kind of favor if we just magically waved a wand and got them all to shut up. Because I'm kind of like, no, actually, some of the most important information you get from speech is, as I keep on coming back to, is knowing what people really think.
Right.
And realizing how far gone the ideology had become on campus is one of the reasons why we're having a serious discussion about reform at the moment. So it's good that people saw this. I mean, for me, it's a sign of how much the administrators have failed. And actually, that's not even entirely true. They didn't actually, like, some of them didn't actually even fail. These students came in. They were from orientation on up. They were fed an idea that life is. I know you thought you came to this institution to learn a more sophisticated way of looking at the world. We're going to give you a less sophisticated way of looking at the world. It turns out there's evil people and there's good people, and the evil people are oppressors. The good people are the oppressed. You can kind of tell everyone who's rich, and that's the entire oversimplified narrative of humanity. And we want you to be activists, and we want you to fight against the oppressors. And of course, when they actually, apply some of this oversimplified thinking, it turns into this kind of, who's the good guy? It must be Hamas, which is a true success for the activist class of administrators at universities, which are very, very powerful. It is an utter failure from the educational perspective, because, like, from the very beginning, it should have been instilling in people epistemic humility, like the idea that kind of like the whole point of this is to come in and be a little less sure exactly everything about the entire world. And I think that there are schools that address this actually much better. I always give credit to Dartmouth for having this very public colloquium, very public class that was a dialogue between a pro-Palestinian professor and a pro-Israeli professor. That really helped take down the temperature there, because you got to see intelligent people disagreeing about this. But so much of the sort of simple-minded political observations that were kind of like on display, they initially came from the university itself, whether it understood that it was doing that or not.
So long-time listeners here know that I have this evolving view about intellectual history, where I think that ideas are often lagging indicators rather than leading indicators.
Ooh, I love it.
And that, so like the way I usually explain it to people is, if you look back in the 20th century of supposedly like hugely influential books that changed the American mind about this, or the political elite's mind about this or that.
Yeah.
It turns out that a lot of the time they were in fact totems that were created to respond to these ripening ideas that then people could pick up and say, see, I was right. So it's like, it's a validation of ideas that were already in the water. I think Herbert Crowley's Promise of American Life is like that. What's his name? Charles Reich's The Greening of America, which is a garbage book, but it was like,
is
people
it worse than the population bomb?
Population bomb would be another example. Is right that people have this innate or mass cultural or psychological angst about something, and then a book comes out and says, "Told you so," and people gravitate towards it. And so it's, anyway. The point I want to get at, though, is one place where I think that's not always the case. I mean, again, it's complicated and nuanced. I'm not trying to say it's never the case that ideas matter. Ideas often matter, but college campuses, particularly higher education, faddish ideas move people really, really well. And so I'm kind of curious, like, if you were going to do an intellectual history of why you think speech is the free speech idea, the idea of free speech has come so out of favor.
Yeah.
Who are the intellectuals that you think are most responsible? Is it Foucault reducing everything to power? Is it Nietzsche who kind of beat, who Foucault was ripping off? I mean, like, is it the Frankfurt School Marxists? Who is it that you think was so fashionable that people said, who was the Ibram Kendi is a good example of a lagging indicator because these ideas existed long before he came on the scene. But who are the people that you think kind of drove this?
It's almost a boring answer at this point. But people who point out the Frankfurt School are right.
Yeah.
The fact that Herbert Marcuse wrote Repressive Tolerance in 1965, 1 year after the beginning of the free speech movement in Berkeley. I always point out the anti-free speech movement is only 1 year, younger than the free speech movement. And it's really impressive. So for canceling, I went back and reread Repressive Tolerance, and I forgot how simple-minded this thing was. It's just, and people really get weird about Marcuse. Like they talk about him like he was like one-dimensional man. It's incredibly simplistic. Kind of typically sort of European dismissal of American sort of desire for commodities. But repressive tolerance, really, it's just making the argument that, well, if we want equality, the good people have to have free speech. And the bad people, which he flatly defines as the so-called right, the conservatives, need to not have it so we can actually fix society. And I'm like, wow, congratulations. You've just invented classic authoritarianism, or actually totalitarianism. And there were people who really liked this idea, thought it was sophisticated somehow. And then there was the people who actually founded critical race theory, and that's also just true because that was Richard Delgado, who I debated once at Williams back early in my career, and that was a trip. And people like Mary Matsuda, Kimberly Crenshaw, like the very first thing when they all got together is they wrote Words That Wound. Delgado wrote that back in the early 80s, but then they wrote a book version of it in 1994, where all of the founders of critical race theory were together on it, which leads to a kind of funny situation for me is like, we have been, willing to go to court to defend the right to teach critical race theory. But anytime people like bring it up in a very positive light, particularly if they're other First Amendment people, like, by the way, the very first thing you should mention though, when you talk about this, is the very first thing that critical race theory people did was propose new limitations on freedom of speech. So I think that intellectual tradition, I think Marcuse was pivotal in changing the idea of, well, and I feel bad as someone who was working class growing up and worked in restaurants since I was 11. I really feel bad that the proletariat really let down the intellectuals. Because that's really essentially what a lot of the Frankfurt School people were saying, particularly these Americans who actually seem to be enjoying being comparatively affluent to the whole rest of the world. And it really turned into this idea of the scholarly class, like the intellectual class should be the leaders. And this is Herbert Marcuse's words, not mine, and that the ghetto population could basically be their proletarians. And this absolutely unapologetically kind of elitist idea had a lot of, it was already something, but by the time I went to law school and undergrad, like it wasn't quite everywhere. It was kind of fringy in the 90s because the left had taken such a blow in the 80s and 90s that, that's one of the reasons why I grew up liberal, is because like in the 80s and 90s, particularly by the time you got to the 90s, the left were kind of like the weirdos who still thought Stalin wasn't that bad. And it's like, okay, no, that's messed up. Nobody believes that anymore. But somehow the worst aspects of the most deeply ideological stuff that we thought we'd left behind in the 70s, it's all back and on steroids.
Yeah. I mean, another great example of that is from another Frankfurt School guy, Theodor Adorno, right? Who comes up with the F scale, which is the measurement of, it's supposedly a scientific psychological test to see how fascist you are. That's what the F stands for. And the thing is like, to really dumb it down, totally agree that the more you like Hitler or Mussolini, the more fascist you are.
Fair.
But he said that the more you like Stalin, the less fascist you are. And that's the problem, is if you don't count authoritarianism on your own or totalitarianism on your own side as bad, it's really an ideology of power, right? It's like,
Yeah.
we're the good guys, we should be in charge, and then we get to say what's free speech and what's not, or what's freedom and what's not.
I had this argument because like I'm Russian and like we were serfs, going back away, and my grandfather fought the Bolsheviks, and we lost, and I had to have these arguments with Americans who knew nothing about history, about like believing there's a stark distinction between fascism and communism. And the thing they kept on falling down on, like being kind of like, yeah, but the fascists, the Nazis were racist, and I'm kind of like, okay. Yeah. Communists are not racist in theory.
Right.
They are incredibly racist in practice.
Right.
Like, and usually I would be snottily like, "Have you ever met a Russian?" Like this is not this great egalitarian philosophy. And otherwise, it's all centralization of power. It's all very romanticization of violence. Control over thought. It's the same freaking thing.
Yeah. I mean, Richard Pipes, the intellectual historian, he said it well, which was that both Bolshevism and Nazism are heresies of socialism.
Yeah.
And they come out of the same sort of intellectual revolutionary tradition. All right. I could geek out on that stuff all day long, but I want to come back.
And by the way, Suicide of the West, I quite enjoyed it. And
thank you.
And you parallel Rousseau, and I can't remember who the one you had to stand for liberalism was.
I put in Locke, but you can put somebody else if you like. I mean, Smith works for me better in some ways, but
Yeah.
Thank you.
Rousseau was a jerk.
Rousseau was a jerk. That is a
He's
true
mean
fact.
to David Hume too, which is definitely a way to piss me off.
So you mentioned AI before,
yes,
and my natural instincts are always, when someone says this is going to be revolutionary and change the world and all that kind of stuff, my instincts are usually to say, slow your roll, we'll see, blah, 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 blah. It does feel like this might be different.
Yeah.
And probably is in certain fields for sure, and less so in other fields, and we'll just have to wait and see. But one of the things I think a lot of people don't understand about the LLM stuff, these large language models that run ChatGPT and all that kind of stuff, is they're just essentially plagiarism machines.
Yeah.
And they, the old garbage in, garbage out thing is a problem. So if Wikipedia is biased, the authoritative answers from AI are going to be heavily influenced by the bias of Wikipedia or some other, or the New York Times, right? I mean, that's one of these debates. How do you think about how we should think about AI as a free speech matter?
I have so one thing that I'm trying to do is to expand FIRE's tech practice, because just the issues are getting more serious and more complicated in some ways, and harder to explain to the public. So I'm trying to grow that right now. It's one of my big priorities for next year. And my biggest fear, as I alluded to before, is that I live right on Capitol Hill. I'm actually on Capitol Hill right now. Mm-hmm. And it was so clear that open philanthropy, was trying to scare everyone on Capitol Hill that AI was such an immediate existential threat that we better regulate it like crazy, which might coincidentally give the incumbents huge power over AI. So just a classic regulatory capture play. So when I testified before Congress back in February, that was my point. It is like, and the worst thing that would happen would, if the development of AI was left in too few hands, the same people who messed up the production of knowledge in academia would then have it for the whole operating system of the species. So I'm much more concerned about concentration of power over AI than I am of AI itself, at least at this point.
As a speech issue, right? I mean,
as a
giving it access to nuclear weapons is probably not
sure,
ideal.
yeah. As a speech issue, but also production of knowledge. It can potentially be this, because free speech and production of knowledge inextricably linked, like just unavoidably. Truth is the primary justification for free speech. Well, I think about truth slightly differently. So I think AI could be this incredible boom for knowledge production, and I think it could be this incredible boon for that matter, doing what I would knowledge through subtraction. I mean, I feel like we should be unleashing AI on a lot of the existing scholarship that we have in academia, because an awful lot of it is p-hacked, an awful lot of it is just outright plagiarized, and we should be able to know that. But that's how you actually learn. You learn by subtraction. So I think there's a potential boon for knowledge itself that we could absolutely screw up.
Oh, I'm with you there. We have a great capacity for screwing things
yes,
up.
we do.
By the way, just because it comes into my head, and I'm sort of contractually obliged to plug Yuval Levin's book, his most recent book, American Covenant. Part of his whole point, which is very in line with your stuff, is that the American political system, from the Constitution, the First Amendment, to divided government, separation of powers, the whole point is about competition.
Yeah.
Not about unity.
Yeah.
And the problem is as a matter of bad civics, we tell people all the time that what this country needs more is more unity, more agreement, when in fact what we need is more agreement to disagree better.
Yeah.
Right? To argue better. And that has sort of been lost. And that I've always had this thing since my first book, that the cult of unity is really just power worship, because people like the idea of unity to have, anybody who says the time for debate is over, I've never heard anybody say, hey, look, the time for debate is over. We need to put aside our partisan differences and our ideological divides. So I'm going to abandon all of my positions and agree with you. Right? People only ever say that when they want you to shut up and get on their program, on their train.
Yep.
And that is something that is just completely lost in civic discourse, particularly in higher education.
Well, this is one of these things that I find really funny when people talk about bias. And I've literally heard, professors talk about bias as being, because it's the word that they use to mean prejudice, but
Right.
They want to go something more abstract that's all penetrating, and they talk about like we only more recently started to understand bias, and I'm like, what are checks and balances if not a protection against natural human bias? Like the founders were incredibly good evolutionary psychologists, and these checks and balances systems are so important to actually check the fact that individually we all tend to think we're right.
Right.
And I think a lot about sort of potential reforms for higher education, a lot of it comes down to different adversarial approaches that could actually, really challenge the way we do knowledge production. So one thing that I love, Corey Clark and a number of other scholars did this great paper on adversarial collaboration, which was, I think, a Kahneman idea, where you get like two scholars who completely disagree with each other working together to figure out, which one was right, more or less.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the things that we need more counter institutions. We need things that are actually pointing out, the flaws in the knowledge that we think we're producing. So yeah, that competition, like that's fundamental to the American, why we've been a successlike country. So I should read that book.
Yeah, no, you should. I mean, it's like the idea of settled science, right? The whole point of science is to unsettle settled science. And
it's not the way it works. It's frustrating.
And you're absolutely right. Factions by definition are biased. That's why we call them factions.
Yeah.
All right. So, but quickly, a bunch of people want me to ask you this. Do you think on net, Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter has been good for free speech, bad for free speech, mixed bag? How do you look at it?
I think it's been good for free speech on balance, to be honest. I think he's done some things that we've called out and we've pointed out are bad for free speech. We think there's been situations where he hasn't necessarily stood up for it internationally. There's been other situations where he has, which I felt like he deserved more credit for. But I think that I didn't like fully. I mean, I guess I knew, but like how much Twitter was reflecting sort of like the sort of, Harvard Ivy League kind of agreement on what is and isn't true. Like it's so easy to get yourself deranked for saying things that, should be uncontroversial. And so I do think actually, I think that ultimately the change in Twitter was ultimately good for free speech. Could I be proven horribly, horribly wrong at some point? Absolutely, I could. But even the fact that it drove people over to, other websites, I think that's good. I mean, people were actually trying to make an argument for social media regulation based on the idea that you basically, for all intents and purposes, you had to be on X, you had to be on Twitter, which when Elon bought it, was quickly proven to be just complete BS, and particularly even more so now that more people are flowing out. So I think it's good. But we'll see.
So let me ask you. This is purely devil's advocate here, but
you could do it.
And obviously you would represent the devil in a free speech case, so
absolutely,
I'm not worried about it. But early on you pointed out, and I didn't want to get in the weeds because it's confusing to people about what's happening in the Jesse Singal on Blue Sky, which is this dominated by liberals alternative to Twitter. And I agree with you. What they're doing is gross and stupid, and it's very reminiscent of Twitter from like 8 years ago, right? It was like crowd mobs and lying about him and saying he's going to hurt people, so they have to ban him from the site and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's all stupid, and they shouldn't do that. At the same time, we just talked about your argument for why Twitter, Elon's Twitter is good is because it created alternative institutions that do things differently and they compete differently. What is wrong with different institutions, whether it's Twitter or Blue Sky or Threads or whatever, having different rules of the road about what kind of discourse can happen internally? Or do they all have to have the exact same model of free speech rules?
I think it's good that there is more competition. I think the problem, one of the reasons why I think in net, I think Elon buying X was good for free speech, is that a lot of the other platforms looked exactly the same. They seemed to come into the same assumption. So it was good to have a platform that basically seemed to be the polar opposite of
right. No, I get that, but like you're denouncing Blue Sky for its model of going after Jesse Siegel, and I agree with you that they shouldn't be doing what they're doing, but like you can't say we're going to create new. It was good because it created competing institutions with different rules and different models, and then say, but all the models.
There's nothing inconsistent about that. That's basically saying that they're trying to see if they can make their less tolerant kind of model work, and it looks like it's kind of a train wreck. But that's a good thing to know. That's a good thing to see. It's a good thing to have the freedom to be able to join it. But it does sound like it's becoming a sort of circular firing squad over there, and I may be wrong. Maybe it's just seeing that a particularly bad example of Jesse. Maybe it's a wonderful flowering in every other way. But I do think those experiments are incredibly worthwhile. Yeah, even if the experiment ends up not being a success.
All I would push back on is to say, this is less devil's advocate now, because I basically agree with you. But the experiment of Elon taking over is what created Blue Sky.
Yeah.
Right. And I do think that there is a inherent bias to Twitter now that leans pro MAGA.
Yeah.
It's certainly, I find and this gets to where we started as well, the people who thought Twitter's bias pre-Elon was an outrage worthy of government intervention. Now think Elon's bias is the flowering of free speech, and the people who like the old system are saying, no, someone needs to do something about this. Like culturally, I'm not saying legally, but culturally, I didn't like either model.
Yeah.
And but the sort of switching teams about what should be censored or policed by the state and what shouldn't really just sort of does bring us back to this idea about whose ox is being gored.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm never disappointed by people not being consistent on freedom of speech, because I just kind of expect it. But I do think having, diversity of platforms is great.
Yeah. Fair enough. All right. I promised I'd get you out by 10 minutes after the hour. I'm 8 minutes out. So I'm going to let you go, because anything else I ask you about is going to start a whole new conversation. Thank you so much for doing this. And again, my apologies for being late.
Oh, no problem. Can I make one shout out for one thing, though?
Absolutely. Be my guest.
The FIRE Campus Free Speech Rankings. I really hope your readers will check it out, particularly if you have kids or grandkids, or if you want to attend school yourself. It's the most comprehensive study ever done on whether or not particular schools are good for free speech. UVA actually finished number 1 this past year. Harvard got a -20 and finished dead last this year. So definitely, I hope more people will check it out.
Glad to do it. We'll put it in the show notes. And I should say, every now and then we run ads from FIRE, and we're happy to do it. So if people think that's a conflict, go suck eggs. So there you go. Greg Lukianoff, from the head poobah of FIRE, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Jonah. It was great chatting with you.